Okay, so again, the stuff that I'm teaching you today is not new. It's all stuff that we've seen. We're just now pushing it together in a format that looks different. Is that okay? So somebody tell me, what does the word bisector mean?
It'll split up into 2 equal parts.
Good. It's cut into 2 equal parts. If we're talking about a segment and we cut it into 2 equal parts, what word do you think we're looking for? If we take a segment and cut it into 2 equal parts, what's another word for that? In your journal, we had it written, and I told you to write that it's not this, it's something else. Midpoint. Excellent. It is your midpoint. Okay, I want to remind you that we have the midpoint formula, x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and y1 plus y2 divided by 2. It is in your journal on the yellow paper, right? In the back of your journal. Okay, and then right here, they're talking about a perpendicular. What is perpendicular again?
They're intersecting.
Intersecting how? 90 degrees. And what comes to mind right away when we say perpendicular?
Or.
Or, very good. Or. Why or? What does that mean? What are we going to do? What does opposite mean? How? Good. Positive and negative. And reciprocal tells us to flip them, right? Very good. Now, the other thing it tells me here is that we need to find slope-intercept form. What is slope-intercept form?
Y equals mx plus b.
Y equals mx plus b. Very good. Okay? It tells me we have endpoints, and they gave them to me right here. Now, on this paper, I gave you graph paper because I want you to visualize what I'm doing at each step. Are you with me? I'm going to tell you you're not always going to have graph paper, so you may have to rely on formulas. I'm going to remember that last week we talked about calculators, and to find slope, you can plug it into stat. Right, remember us talking about that? But I want to remind you that there's a formula, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And that's how to find slope. There is actually a formula, or you can use the calculators. Okay? So the first step is to graph the segment. So over 2, up 2. That's going to be point A. And then B is at 4, negative 4. Which I believe is right here, correct? So here's my segment. And I want to find the perpendicular bisector. So if I have to find the bisector, what would I find again?
Midpoint.
The midpoint. There's a formula, right? And the midpoint says to add my x's. Remember I told you to stack them, didn't I? And we're going to add them. What's 2 plus 4? 6. What's 2 minus 4? 2 plus a negative 4 is what?
2.
A negative 2. And then we have to cut those in half, don't we? So 6 divided by 2 is 3. And negative 2 divided by 2 is a negative 1. So if I graph those, if I graph 3, negative 1, that's this point right here. As you're like, line a little crooked, you'll forgive me, right? I want to remind you that if I did this way, this is 2 units. What's half of 2? 1. That means that my midpoint has to land on this line. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What's half of 6? 3. So if I go back 3, that means my midpoint has to land. Is that where I got it? Yes. So I just showed you 2 ways of working on that midpoint. Are we good? Then, the next step says find the slope of a line that's perpendicular. How do I do that? Don't first have to find out what the slope is?
Yes.
Do I have a positive slope or a negative slope?
It's negative.
Okay, I have a negative slope. So isn't it down 6 and over 2? Negative 6 over 2, which is really what? Negative 3 over 1. But I want one that's perpendicular to that. Good, that's when I have to think about my or. So it's going to be a positive 1 over 3. Now it wants us to graph the perpendicular bisector, which means I need to use this new slope, and I need to put it over here to where it goes through the bisector. Well, isn't that the midpoint? So that means start at the midpoint and use this new slope, up 1 and over 3. Which means I can go down 1 and back 3, right? Are we okay? So now I know that this line right here not only cuts this segment into 2 equal parts, but that this is 90 degrees. It is a perpendicular, and it cut that segment into 2 equal parts. Okay, now I need to write the equation. Okay, now we need to write the equation. So that means y equals mx plus b. What's my slope? Okay, my 1/3 comes in right here, right? Now I need to find out what my b is. What's b stand for? The y-intercept. Hey, if I'm looking here, I can see that it crosses right here, which is at a -2, right? But Mr. Ramsey, what happens if they didn't give me the graph? Well, if they didn't give me the graph, then I know that I have the midpoint, right? And I have the new slope. So I would plug that in, y minus y1 is equal to m times x minus x1. So that would be y minus, my midpoint is at -1 here. My new slope is at 1/3. And then it would be x minus my x value, which would be 3. I can distribute here, right? So this becomes a positive because it's y plus 1 is equal to 1/3 x. And then it's going to be 1/3 times a -3 over 1. Well, what's 1 times -3?
-3.
And what's 3 times 1? What's -3 divided by 3? A -1. And then from here, I would have to subtract 1 from both sides, right? So that gives me y is equal to 1/3 x minus 2. Did I get the same thing here? Did it seem easier to use the graph?
Yes.
Yes, but they're not always going to give you a graph. Okay, so again, we're going to do the perpendicular bisector. So the bisector means I need to find the midpoint. So I use the midpoint formula, which is right here in blue, right? And we add our x's and we add our y's. That's how I got 2 and 4. Because -3 plus 5 is 2. 3 plus 1 is 4. Then in the formula it says that we have to divide those by 2. So half of 2 is 1 and half of 4 is 2. So this point right here is very important because that's what I'm going to use later to plug into my formula when I'm trying to find out my y-intercept. Then I have to find out the perpendicular part, which means that I need to find the slope. Again, I can use the slope equation. I can use your calculator with the stat function, right? Yes, I have a graph. I can even use the graph. Okay, but I'm going to tell you again that at some point in time we're not going to have graphs. So I don't want you to write fully on them. So here, y2 minus y1. So 3 minus 1, and then -3 minus 5. That gives me 2 over -8. I can reduce that down to 1 over -4. But I don't want that. I want the opposite reciprocal. So I'd have to do, instead of a negative, I make it a positive, and I flip my numbers. Remember, our ultimate goal is to write the y equals mx plus b format, right? Well, right now I just have the slope. I don't know what my y-intercept is. So that's where I use the point slope formula. Because the point I'm going to use is my midpoint, and I have my new slope. So that's why we did y minus 2. The 2 came from the back end of my midpoint. That's going to equal my new slope, which is just a 4. And then x minus my 1 came from on the midpoint formula. And then here I would distribute 4 times x would be 4x. 4 times -1 gives me -4. And then I'm going to solve this equation getting y by itself. So I add 2 to both sides. So y equals 4x minus 2. So this right here is what they were looking for as my final answer.